Okay, hello and welcome to our audience members joining us from across the globe. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. I know that all of you in the audience today are following closely and concerned about events in the region over the weekend, but I think what makes our institute quite unique is our ability to still focus on important local developments in the Gulf while also keeping an eye on the bigger picture. And with that, we are truly pleased to be hosting this discussion today, looking at the latest parliamentary elections in Kuwait and what they could mean for the future of democratic politics in the country. We have an excellent panel of experts with us today. I'll introduce them here very briefly and share their full bios in the chat with you all. First, I'd like to welcome back Yasmena al-Mulla. Yasmena is a freelance journalist based in Kuwait. Previously, she was a producer at the Kuwait-based news outlet Manshoor, covering political and social issues in the Gulf. Her work has appeared in Gulf News, Politics Today, Kuwait Times, Middle East Eye, Amouage Media, and Rasif 22. Also, a warm welcome to Sean Yom. He is an associate professor of political science at Temple University and a senior fellow in the Middle East program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's a specialist on regimes and governance in the Middle East, especially in Arab monarchies. His research engages topics of democratic reforms, institutional stability, and economic development in these countries, as well as their implications for U.S. foreign policy. Last but not least is my colleague Kristin Diwan. She is a senior resident scholar at AGSIW. Her current projects concern generational change, nationalism, and the evolution of Islamism in the countries of the GCC. Her analysis of Gulf affairs has appeared in many publications, among them Foreign Affairs, Financial Times, and The Washington Post. Moderating the session today is AGSIW President Ambassador Douglas Silliman. He previously served as U.S. Ambassador to Iraq and U.S. Ambassador to Kuwait. Before that, he served as a senior advisor in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs in the U.S. Department of State and was Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Iraq, Minister Counselor for Political Affairs in Baghdad, and Deputy Chief of Mission in Ankara, Turkey. And with that, Doug, over to you.
Raymond, thank you very much for the introduction. And Yasmena, Sean, and Kristin, I'm really happy to have you here this morning. As Raymond mentioned, AGSIW is able to do, walk and chew gum at the same time. While we're watching what has been happening in the Levant, we also need to watch what's happening in the Gulf. And over the weekend and even today, there's been a significant development in Kuwait where the Amir has announced the appointment of a new prime minister. We will talk about that a little later in our conversation. But we want to talk at first about the elections that took place in Kuwait about 2 weeks ago. It's the third set of parliamentary elections in Kuwait in the last 18 months, and the fourth in the last 5 years. There's been a very quick turnover because of the inability of the government, the parliament, and the Emir to cooperate on a common agenda. We'd like to talk about the democratic process in Kuwait. We'd like to talk about how the elections work, what the results are, and most importantly, with the new prime minister named, looking forward to what might come of these elections in the new parliament. So I want to start, Kristin, if you can help us put the April 4th elections into the broader context of Kuwaiti democracy and the recent history of parliamentary elections. That'd be a good place to start, I think.
Sure. Thanks so much, Ambassador. Well, I think the first and most important thing to mention is that this is the first election taking place under Emir Meshal, al-Ahmed, al-Sabah. They came at his initiative. He's the one who chose to dissolve prematurely, I guess, within its term, but constitutionally, the parliament. And I think really then what we need to think about is the stamp that he wants to put on government going forward. As the ambassador mentioned, Kuwait has quite a history of a number of different elections that come for different reasons. But I think clearly this one is very associated with the fact that we have a new Amir. The last government, it's important to note, under or previously, the previous leader, Emir Ahmed, Nawaf al-Ahmed, had as the head of his government his son, Ahmed Nawaf. And I think it's important just to frame a bit what that government looked like. He pursued a rather populist agenda, I would say, one that would really gain him more cooperation with the parliament. This included providing a number of pardons kind of across the board of different political figures, which really facilitated the ability to create a program with the parliament. He also rehabilitated an important, if contentious, figure within the ruling family, Ahmed al-Fahed, who was really helping him with those relations with the parliament. And also he was helped by the fact that they had gotten a new Speaker of the Parliament. The old venerable Speaker Ahmed Saadoun had replaced the Speaker Marzouk al-Ghanem, who had a rather contentious relationship, it's fair to say, with the Parliament. So we can say that they had actually generated a program, a quite populist program. I don't think it was popular with all Kuwaitis, but it definitely worked better with the Parliament. But his reign, of course, or his leadership of the government, Nawaf al-Ahmed, ended with the death of his father. And clearly then the new Emir wants to, establish his own rule with his own program. And we know now he previously had appointed Dr. Mohammed Sabah al-Salam, who was a very popular choice as prime minister. It seems that he has perhaps refused to come back, or that the Emir has chosen another path. And as you mentioned, Doug, the new head of the government is someone who's very associated with the Emir himself and with his court. He was previously head of his court. So I think we're really looking at, Meshal's government, Meshal's election, and we can kind of put it in that context moving forward.
Thank you, Kristin. And I want to go next to Yasmin, because one of the features that has always surprised me of Kuwaiti politics, even when they were working relatively well, is the tension between governments and parliaments, with each side blaming the other for the inability to get things done. Yasmena, what kinds of things have kept Kuwaiti parliaments and governments from being effective in the past? And what are some of the reasons that there have been three sets of elections and three parliaments over the past 18 months?
Thank you, Doug. So I think that, in the last few years, we've seen a lot of political instability, deadlock between the government and parliament. As you mentioned, in the last 4 years, this is our fourth new parliament. Around the same time, we've had around 8 governments headed by 3 different prime ministers, and as well during this time leadership did change. So we were under the leadership with the first election 2020 under the late Emir Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed, and then following that the last 2 elections under the late Emir Sheikh Nawaf al-Ahmed, and now the latest election, as Kristin mentioned, was the first election under the new leadership of His Highness the Emir Sheikh Meshal al-Sabah. So I think a lot of changes have been happening, and so that could be one of the reasons for, let's say, the constant changes in the last few years, I would say. One of the things I'd like to note at is specifically to the last parliament and why it was dissolved. It was short-lived, and I think that the Emir Sheikh Meshal was unhappy with the state of affairs, especially after he stated in his December speech, when he took an oath in front of Parliament and said that both entities, meaning government and Parliament, cooperated and agreed upon harming the interest of the country and of the people. He was mainly referring to the amnesties and pardons that took place, as to the ones Kristin was talking about earlier. It can also be said that the dissolution came as a or kind of an indirect result of what MP Abdul Karim Kandiri said in Parliament when he directly addressed the Emir, So it could be said that this new leadership will not tolerate these kinds of actions, hence leading to the dissolution. I think, the changes that were happening in the last few years, like I said, weren't happening in a vacuum, but due to several different factors, being of changing of leadership, the emerging of old or new political figures, and lastly, the changes that's happening with the government.
Thank you, Yasmena. Sean, let me turn to you and ask that same question, because you just recently wrote a short article in the Journal of Democracy, explaining some of the tensions between the Kuwaiti monarchy, the governments, and the parliament. So what have you seen in the past couple of years in Kuwait, and is there a way forward? You had a relatively downbeat assessment in your piece, but I didn't know what you might, if anything you've seen since you wrote that may alter any of the predictions or thoughts that you had in your article.
Thanks, Doug. Well, the good news is that anything that happens in Kuwaiti politics in the coming months will have already happened before, whether it is a suspension of parliamentary life or continued gridlock. So neither is new. I think the question is which path will become more viable for the Kuwaiti state and the royal government. I think what I would emphasize, in addition to Yasmina's excellent comments about understanding the conflict between the popularly elected Majlis and the royally appointed government in recent years, is that much of the problem that I see as a comparative political scientist that stems much of the problem of recurrent executive, legislative, government, parliamentary tensions reflects the very peculiar rules of the game that govern the Kuwaiti constitution and parliamentary politics. These rules make Kuwaiti politics unique, I think, not just in the Gulf, but in all of the Arab world, in terms of just how much veto power and disruptive ability that the popularly elected parliament actually has in halting the government's lawmaking agenda. So we've seen all of these rules in effect in recent years, whether it is the ability of very small groups of parliamentarians to motion to interpellate ministers or publicly question them, and thereby essentially halt that day's legislative agenda, or the threats to submit no cooperation motions, which force the Emir oftentimes to shuffle the government or to withdraw a particularly threatening or offensive law or bill. And I think that because the rules of Kuwaiti politics and its constitution put an emphasis, given the autonomy that elected legislatures have in questioning ministers and refusing to cooperate with the government, because the constitution puts so much responsibility upon their shoulders, there's a premium in Kuwaiti politics that has to be put on the very informal negotiations and personal compromises and face-to-face bargains that have always happened between the Emir, his representatives, the Emirs of government, and various parliamentary factions. Since the 1960s, that kind of behind-the-scenes informal tit-for-tat bargaining and compromise process, that's often how laws have gotten passed. And I think the breakdown of coordination in the last few years reflects a few things. One is that there's growing mistrust of the royal executive and the royally appointed government on part of a number of elected legislative blocs or factions. I think that also as well, Kuwaiti parliaments have just become more fractious, more diverse, that there are more blocs and trends in parliament now than I think the architects of the constitution ever could have imagined 60 years ago. And that makes for a very feckless legislative chamber at times. And finally, I think that the power of personality and money shouldn't be underestimated. And those have been in full effect as well in the last few years. I mean, so we political scientists call systems like what's happening in Kuwait now under different terms, like semi-democracy or competitive authoritarianism, but we also call them terms like clientelism, personalism, neo-patrimonialism. I think a simpler way to put it is that there are two things which matter a lot for the royally appointed government and the popularly elected parliament to cooperate. And those two things are personalities and money. And Kuwaiti politics is awash with both. There are very big, ambitious personalities on both sides in Kuwaiti politics, and there's a lot of money that exchanges hands, both officially and unofficially. And I think that makes for the kind of delicate equipoise, the bargains between the parliament and the royally appointed governments that have let lawmaking in the past proceed. It's made it really difficult in recent years. And with the breakdown of trust in the royal executive by a number of legislatures, this makes the repeated game of musical chairs, like the kind of the repeated pauses and plays of politics, snap elections, government dissolutions. It makes it essentially the status quo. So we either continue on with this pathway, or Kuwaiti politics has to hit the reset button and do something drastically different. One of which, not the only, but one option of which could be a temporary suspension of parliamentary life, as has happened before in Kuwaiti history.
Sean, I'm going to leave that point out there for just a minute. And I want to go back to Yasmena and then Kristin, because I was really quite surprised that a very respectable 62% of Kuwaitis voted in the most recent elections, even though there has been this inability for governments and parliaments to coordinate, even though there have been 3 elections in the past 19 months. So, Yasmena, can you describe a little bit about the period leading up to the elections? What were the biggest issues? Why did so many Kuwaitis decide to vote, although even though I think many of them didn't expect that there would be a significant change in the results?
Yeah, so 62% is kind of in line with the voter turnout for the last few years. It's important to mention that the last 2 elections, the 2023 elections and the 2022 elections, no official numbers were announced by the government in regards to voter turnout, but many, local analysts and media speculate that it was around the 50-60%. So it was a big turnout, like you said, despite the fact that this was the 4th election in 4 years, and also it took place during the holy month of Ramadan. So I think that was a shock to many people. In regards to the campaigning, I think there hasn't been much campaigning. It was actually quite a quiet campaign period this time compared to the last. It's important to note that only 200 candidates ran for elections. This is the lowest number of candidates that we have seen in the last decade, and of which 13 were women. And so I think that the low number of candidates signaled that we wouldn't have expect a huge change in results, and which actually did happen. So just to quickly talk about some of the results, only 7 of the former incumbent MPs that ran lost their seats. And so that was pointing to that there wasn't a huge turnaround in the number of names and faces of the MPs. Only 3 MPs from the previous parliament didn't run. 2 decided just not to run, and 1 was barred from running. So there wasn't a big change. Those that did win, a lot of them were big and known names that returned to the scene, like Ubaid al-Wasmi, Saleh Ashur, and sorry, I forgot the last name. It will come to me. So yeah, it was not too much change has happened. I think in response to your question, Doug, about why is the voter turnout high despite the fact that these elections have been occurring more frequently, I think while there's no clear reason for why the voter turnout remains steady despite the constant change, I think it's that it has to do that Kuwaitis valuing their right to vote. I think often dubbed as the democratic wedding, Kuwaitis, even though they're disenfranchised at times, realize the uniqueness of going to the polls and voting and understand it as a privilege in comparison to their neighbors. So I think, understanding the psyche of the Kuwaiti voter is important as well, because although there is frustration at times with the constant changes, I think that the Kuwaitis still value this right that they have.
Thank you, Yasmena. Kristin, you went to Kuwait to see the elections. I also was interested. I mean, I was there a couple of months ago, and in discussions with friends and colleagues and in a couple of Diwaniyas, there was a lot of talk about really big issues, things like citizenship, things about the usefulness of parliament and the future direction of the country under the new Amir. So what did you see in the elections? And I know that you went around to a bunch of the rally tents, especially on election day. And what were people talking about as you were watching the elections?
Yeah, thanks, Ambassador. And As you mentioned, I was invited to observe the elections by the Ministry of Information. And so I was able to really get quite a good view to be able to go around to all the different polling stations on election day. I was actually there for the opening of the elections. I was there for the closing of the elections, which by the way happened at midnight, which tells you Kuwaitis again how committed they are to voting. People were still coming in to vote at midnight in Kuwait. That must be rather unique amongst electoral systems. And I was also able to speak to some of the winning candidates, especially the ones that got the top seats within their different districts after the campaign. I think just because I had a little bit more of a personal connection to it, I would really want to underline Yasmena's last point, which is that I'm sure we're going to talk about, because Sean's written this piece, which I think is really, valuable to add to the conversation, the possibility of Kuwait's parliament being potentially suspended. There is a lot of talk in some circles about Kuwait that maybe they would be better off doing that, especially looking at their neighbors. I think everybody's quite astounded by the changes in Saudi Arabia, for instance, and many people are saying, wow, if you have a really strong executive, things can get done. The royal court's been kind of playing a bigger role in initiating projects and doing it on their own. People can see that. So there is some of that for sure in the Kuwaiti discourse and amongst some circles that's quite popular. But I really do want to underline how much elections and this kind of democratic empowerment is really ingrained in Kuwaitis. This is something that they really fought for. It's something that they really had a role in creating this constitution, which is a powerful constitution that gives them quite a bit of rights that, as you mentioned, other people don't have. And I really was impressed firsthand just to see the way that the elections are managed are quite professional. I've actually worked elections here in the US. I found it quite similar in some ways to how we do things here. They had people managing, people that have handicaps or disabilities or whatever, being able to help usher them into the polls. They have judicial, oversight of the elections. The different campaigns are able to have their members there observing the elections to see how they're going in to count the voters coming in. We can talk about some of the weaknesses as well in that election. It is a very small electorate that gets to vote effectively. But I do think those that are able to vote really value that. And I know the very first poll I went to, they had actually shifted the time of the elections because of Ramadan, as I mentioned, from noon to midnight instead of earlier in the day. And I observed like this elderly man walking from within his neighborhood where the election takes place with a cane, coming to vote. He actually came at the wrong time because they had switched the timing of the elections. But he was there, like wanting to vote right when the election polls opened. And I think that really speaks to, the value. And I got to speak to a lot of voters. And when I asked them, why are you showing up? This is like, do you think there's going to be any changes? And they're like, not really, but this is our responsibility as Kuwaiti citizens to come out and vote. We have to have our voice here. And I think it also speaks to another element, if you want to be a little more cynical, that there's a competitive nature to sort of the representation in parliament, who gets to kind of have somebody who will speak for them. So people do feel like they need to show up to make sure that they have that representation, whether it be through communal groups, kind of tribal groups, or even people to get their kind of views put out there. I think, Doug, we will want to, I'm not going to say that much about it now, but definitely one of the big issues on the agenda was recently, well, in both of his initial speeches, Emir Meshal has spoken about kind of the nature or Kuwaiti identity. He spoke very harshly about kind of the citizenship that was returned to certain people, or kind of bargaining that took place to give people to be pardoned from the previous administration is clearly something he isn't happy with. And he has, under a new Minister of Interior, been withdrawing citizenship from people. I think there's like at least 250 people now, just since he's taken power, that have had their citizenship withdrawn. Supposedly for sort of false reasons, not false reasons, but because they falsified kind of their dual elections, or there's different kind of things that they can't contest, I don't think, in courts but these are the accusations. This is clearly an issue that he feels very strongly about. It's also an issue that's very controversial. Obviously, losing your citizenship is a huge, it's a huge punishment, and it often goes not only to the individual, but to his complete line moving forward within Kuwait. So this is a big political issue moving forward. It's a lot of things that came up in the election. It will be definitely an issue of potentially a contention between the parliament and the Emir. And it's potentially also the reason why Mohammed Sabah Salim chose not to come back. I think that's a little speculative at this point, but there at least has been some conversation that maybe he's very protective kind of his position and reputation, and perhaps he saw this was going to be a contentious issue and may have not. But that's a bit speculative, but I think it's at least something to put out there.
And if I can just add a quick comment to what Kristin just said. So yes, there was a lot of revoking of citizenships leading up to the election, and then you can tell that this was a contentious discussion in Kuwait because some people were for it and some people were against it. Several MPs came out right after being elected, some of them as short as 1-2 days afterwards, saying that if the current Minister of Interior returns, that we will submit an interrogation to the Prime Minister. So it was sending a clear line that we are not, we are not going to cooperate with this Minister of Interiors to happen. And so, again, as Kristin mentioned, there is speculation as to why Dr. Mohammed Sabah Salim didn't return as Prime Minister, but I think a lot of it had to do with the different calls that came from various MPs about the returning of the Minister of Interior.
Sean, I want to move to you for just a minute to speculate a little bit on what the priorities of a new parliament might be without knowing who the speaker is going to be, and it still might be possible to look at that. I mean, Kristin and Yasmena have talked about social and identity issues. There's also a question from my successor as U.S. Ambassador to Kuwait, Larry Silverman, basically asking whether the Emir is ready to make the kinds of difficult economic decisions that might help move Kuwait forward to a brighter economic future. Where do you think economic issues will fall in with social issues, looking at the composition of the new parliament, which is essentially the composition of the old parliament?
Right, that's a great question. I think that there's not going to be a terribly great bit of additional traction on some of these very thorny and controversial fiscal and economic reforms that I think many of us believe absolutely have to occur for the Kuwaiti state to balance its books, and even for it to maintain its own self-imposed development plans, like its own vision projects and mega projects like Silk City, which was one of the cherished goals of the late son of the late Emir Sabah, Sheikh Sabah. And what worries me about Kuwaiti politics moving forward are a few things. I mean, number one is that while we rightfully celebrate, as we should, the very vibrant practice of Kuwaiti democratic elections and political contestation that's just occurred and should continue to occur indefinitely, which is what distinguishes Kuwaiti politics from all other Gulf polities, and frankly, from most other Arab countries as well. The very delicate institutional balance between the royal government and the elected legislature hinges almost entirely at this point upon personal conflicts being resolved and behind the scenes negotiations smoothing out any potential, I think, conflicts or problems. And so institutionally, what's going to happen in the coming, weeks is that as Parliament sets its dates for, meeting for its inaugural session, the new Prime Minister will have to pick his cabinet, and that cabinet will then have to obtain the approval of the new Parliament, and then the political cycle will essentially reset, and the government will have its lawmaking agenda. If the new government under Prime Minister Sheikh Ahmed al-Ahmed continues the somewhat technocratic agenda of the previous government of Sheikh Mohammed Sabah Salim, then certainly there will be a number of very far-reaching economic issues that have to be talked about. Infrastructural upgrades, administrative overhauls, long overdue fiscal reforms, I mean, the budget law, above all, and comprehensive anti-corruption laws, because there is just an enormous amount of fiscal wastage and public resources lost to corruption every year, and that absolutely has to be addressed. And so I think the problem in moving forward and just forecasting the next year, assuming that the government is installed and it gets the approval of the new parliament, and the two executive and legislative actors wrangle forward and try to come up with a productive pathway, is how will the government justify and defend the important economic reforms that have to be made, given that the current parliament, which largely, Doug, as you mentioned, reflects the previous parliament, which essentially carries an essential quality that kind of echoes from the last few parliaments. The elected parliament often can induce or express a kind of neo-populist character in terms of rejecting fiscal austerity and rejecting what it sees are overly harsh economic reforms in favor of, I think, more popular and politically less controversial proposals, such as providing greater redistribution to citizens and more financial leniency for indebted citizens, for instance, and essentially putting money back in the hands of ordinary Kuwaitis. And I think these fiscal and economic problems are going to be on top of the technocratic legislative agenda. They certainly won't be the foremost political issues because there are other institutional problems and crises that have to be resolved, having to do with personal conflicts inside some of these factions, the picking of a new crown prince, which still hasn't taken place, and other important political obstacles. But certainly, I don't think that there is going to be a whole lot of progress on the economic reform agenda in answering Ambassador Silverman's question, because as you note, Doug, the parliament that was just reelected is effectively the same. And while we don't know the composition of the new government, even if the new government is as technocratic as the old one, it's not clear that there's going to be a lot of convergence on policy preferences inside the legislature. So it doesn't give observers a whole lot of hope that these negotiations and legislative disputes will be any smoother in the coming months than they were in the preceding months, which opens the door to talking about longer-term political issues regarding Kuwait's democratic system.
Thanks, Sean. Kristin, let me add an issue from a couple of questions we have in our queue, which is the effect of Parliament and a new government on Kuwaiti foreign policy. I mean, one question asks sort of how much influence does Saudi Arabia have on Kuwaiti politics and on Kuwaiti foreign policy decisions? And I have talked to a number of young Kuwaitis who might have, in an earlier generation, gone off to Abu Dhabi or Dubai to make their economic future. Many are now going to Riyadh, where they see maybe a friendlier social environment and a lot of money for entrepreneurs. But more generally, will the parliament support an emir and a prime minister who want to have a more active Kuwaiti foreign policy role on Palestine, on Gaza, Kuwait as an intermediary with Iran, especially after what you've seen over the past weekend with Iranian attacks on Israel? Does this facilitate? Does it make it easier? Does it, or does it not even really make a difference in the way the emir, the prime minister, and the new foreign minister will approach foreign policy?
I'll say, I mean, that the parliament is a very active body. It does have a lot of voice within Kuwait. I would say it's a minor speaker in terms of foreign policy. I mean, the real initiative in foreign policy really does stand in the hand of the emir and his cabinet. That doesn't mean speakers won't, get kind of involved in some very populist issues. Obviously, the issue of Palestine always is a very important one for Kuwaitis, especially now with the tragedy happening in Gaza. There's a lot of anger. Parliamentarians will speak up about that, and they've done a lot of things further strengthening Kuwait's already quite strong kind of anti-normalization positions with Israel and aiding Palestinians to the degree they can. But I think on these larger issues, they often display, they kind of want to be informed about what's happening. They will get anxious if they feel that certain things aren't being addressed adequately. I think right now for Kuwaitis, a lot of the big issues have to do with relations with Iraq. The Iraq judiciary, I believe, recently has been kind of challenging some of the understandings that were in place as far as the Kuwaiti border. There's a lot of tension kind of with Iraq on this issue. There's also an issue with Iran having to do with a gas field that's supposed to be, I think, actually produced with and coordination with Saudi Arabia that Iran is also having some claim to. And so that's also sort of a border almost issue. These sorts of issues will get the attention of the parliament, and they will want to be advised on them. But I don't think that the parliament is going to be the one. It's really going to be the Emir himself. What we know of him, he does seem to be quite favorable to what's happening in Saudi Arabia. And I think in any case, Kuwait will understand that they need to keep the very powerful Saudi neighbor in mind and everything that they do. Yeah, so that's kind of what I would say to that. I did notice some parliamentarians speaking up just in the last day. I mean, with the attacks that happened from Iran onto Israel, it was interesting that the ones that I saw anyway were very much just stressing that, acknowledging kind of that we don't have a big say in all of this, and what we really need to do is to maintain Kuwaiti unity. And I think that's a very important issue. If you look in Kuwait, of course, this is a population that has a lot of different political opinions in terms of foreign policy. You have a good portion of the Kuwaiti population. I don't know the recent numbers, but it's probably at least 30% or so are Shia, actually. And so a lot of these things that are happening regionally can tend to play out within the Kuwaiti public in sort of dangerous ways. So I think there's an acknowledgement that needs to be sort of watched and protected. And it's good to see at least some of the parliamentarians recognizing that.
Yeah, Yasmena, let me continue in that line of thinking that Kristin just mentioned. I mean, when I was in Kuwait, Sheikh al-Ahmed was the Emir, and he was very engaged in domestic policy and economic policy, especially in foreign policy, and had, as foreign minister, as prime minister and Emir, really directed Kuwaiti foreign policy for 4 generations, or for 4 decades, for a couple of generations. For younger Kuwaitis, what is the role that younger Kuwaitis would like to see the Emir play as versus sort of a larger government? And do they see, what role do they think the parliament should play? Should it be a cooperative relationship where deals are made, as Sean suggests has happened in the past? Or is it something that pushes the government to go farther and faster on a particular area that is of interest to Kuwaitis? So do younger Kuwaitis have a different view of the parliament and governance than their parents and grandparents do?
Yes, thank you for your question. So I think just before that, I'd like to mention a quick thing about the foreign policy. I think, as you mentioned, the late Emir al-Ahmed Sheikh al-Ahmed came from a long history and background of foreign policy. Under the new leadership, His Highness the Emir Sheikh Meshal and the late Emir Sheikh Nawaf both came from a security background. So I think that's an important shift to realize when it comes in terms of leadership and kind of Kuwait's role when it comes to foreign policy and acting as a mediator or a negotiator, as it has taken a front row seat, especially under the late Emir Sheikh Sabah. As to your question about the young Kuwaiti, the younger generation compared to the older one, I think the younger generation is looking around them in the region and they see that, or they've noticed that Kuwait is lagging behind, especially in terms of development, economic advancement, and things like entertainment. You mentioned earlier that a lot of Kuwaitis are eager to move to Saudi and start working there. And this is something we have seen more often in the last couple of years. Even a lot of Kuwaiti businesses, restaurants, companies have been also moving or opening up in Saudi, given that the market there is bigger, and then there is an appetite to, kind of get the ball running. But needless to say, I would think that, still across the age range, the Kuwaitis are still calling for similar demands like increasing of salaries, increasing the cost of living allowance, fighting corruption, and enhancing everything in the infrastructure from roads and schools to hospitals. So I do think, yes, the younger generation would want to see certain changes pushed forward by Parliament, but I think that doesn't necessarily change across the age spectrum. I think, like Sean was discussing earlier, when it comes to economic changes, in the last few years, we've seen a lot of populist demands for, like I mentioned, increasing of salaries, canceling debts, increasing the cost of living allowance. And this is something that I've spoken to with people across different ages, and, feel like this is something that is overdue. Another thing to mention is that, a lot of the younger generation are looking to see younger MPs in Parliament, someone that kind of represents their views and the issues that they care about. Yet, with that being said, that doesn't reflect on the election results, since at the moment, I did a quick estimate, around 76% of the newly elected MPs are between the ages of 40 and 60. So it's kind of, not representative of, let's call them the quote unquote youth. Only around 4 to 5 are in their 30s. So I think, even though these issues are, even though we discuss, the younger generation, I think, like I mentioned earlier, the issues are similar across the board. And I think this is reflected in the choice of MPs.
Okay. Thank you, Yasmena. Sean, I want to address to you one of the questions, again, back to foreign policy for a moment, about attitudes toward China. There's a question is, do Kuwaitis, Kuwait, the new assembly, see China as an economic partner, as a viable political partner? There has been a lot of increase in talk about commercial deals between Kuwait and China, but is there a broader vision of China as a longer-term partner? Where do you think that relationship is going, especially under Sheikh Meshal as Amir?
That's a really good question, and I have to profess I don't have a terribly deep fount of knowledge on this. I just quickly actually Googled the last round of the Arab Barometer just to make sure I'm on solid footing when I make my next few statements. So, economically, there is, at least on the government's part, an openness to accept Chinese investments. Kuwait was, I think, one of the first Gulf countries historically, if not the first Gulf country, to establish formal relations with the Chinese government in Beijing. It was an eager participant in the early proposals and sort of the drafts of the Belt and Road Initiative, and in fact, the Silk City mega project, which technically is still ongoing, is part of the Belt and Road Initiative kind of infrastructure stretching across the Gulf. So I think there is, I think there is certainly enthusiasm on the part of state actors and relevant ministries on trading, investing, and engaging China. On part of ordinary Kuwaitis, that is, this is a question for which I don't have a terribly deep fount of knowledge on. So when the Arab Barometer, which is a kind of fairly rigorous cross-national survey of Arab public opinion that political scientists do every few years, when the Arab Barometer was last in Kuwait in 2019 and asked citizens in Kuwait whether they thought, I think the question was, do you think the Chinese are a good people? Like the biggest category of respondents was like, I don't know, 42%. So, I think that I don't know category being the biggest probably reflects just a relative absence of ordinary social engagement with China. But that obviously, that obviously contrasts with the government's view, which certainly through Silk City and official diplomatic and trade ties has engaged the Chinese government in Beijing enthusiastically. But to be fair, right, the Kuwaiti government is a very well-skilled and savvy diplomatic player, and the Kuwaiti government has long cultivated, and rightfully so, good diplomatic ties with virtually all states and territories across the world, regardless of their ideological inclination. So we would expect that kind of openness on part of the government. I think it remains to be seen what role Chinese investments and maybe cultural influence will have on Kuwaiti society in the coming years.
Thanks, Sean. Kristin, I want to give the next question to you, but also Yasmena, you may have some comments as well from Marianne Lanatza at Lund University. What has been the role of Kuwaiti women in producing the result that we got in the latest Kuwaiti elections? Is there a separate role, or how do women participate? I will note that I guess only one woman was elected in her own right to the parliament, but what role have women played in the process? And how do they get their desires for policy, if they are different from average Kuwaitis, into the system?
Yeah, I'll let Yasmena speak more on this. But as you mentioned, there was only one woman elected to Parliament. If you look at the record within Parliament, I mean, Kuwait women were given the right to vote, I think, in 2005. I think the first Parliament where they were really elected or participated was 2009, where 4 women were elected. That was seen as like a real success and left kind of a positive idea about women, how they might be able to play this big role as members of Parliament. That really hasn't panned out. That size of a woman's constituency as members has not been repeated, unfortunately. So the representation on that level is quite small. And I think it speaks to Kuwait, again, as just a different model. We don't really have this state feminism or state driven thing that we do in the other states, where the states are themselves kind of the leaderships are appointing people, putting quotas. Kuwaiti system is still a very competitive, contentious electoral process. Women have to jump right in there with everyone else. And I think they're doing that at some disadvantage, given sort of still the personal ties and the way that the networks and things work, and how people, even women, perceive what it takes to be a good, effective MP. I think there's still some skepticism that a woman can do that, although there is some appetite for women to be there. So, the women that are getting through are really, I would say, very battle tested and are really doing it on their own feet. They're not getting kind of support on that. And for that reason, there's not many women elected. Yasmena, I don't know, you probably want to add something.
Yeah, just a few more points to add. I think that I'm not sure to this specific election, but I think for previous elections, the number of women, so when it came to voter turnout, the number of women was almost as equal to the number of men when it came to voting. So I think women do have a big part in participating in the political process. As Kristin mentioned, that Kuwait women only got the right to vote in 2005, and so this is still kind of the early stages of female participation in politics. With that being said, it has been moving, let's say, slower than people have expected. As we mentioned, only one MP or female MP won her seat, Jinan Boushehri, who was part of the previous parliament, and to mention also she was a former minister. For example, there were some parliaments without any female representation. So, for example, the 2020 parliament, there was 0 women elected to parliament. Contrary to the 2009 election, there were 4 women that made it to parliament. So I still think the road for female participation in politics is an early one, and I think it's still developing. And I think that there needs to be further discussion as to why we don't have as many female in parliament or even in government as one would think we would. So I think this is constantly a conversation that is being discussed here in Kuwait, and I think one that definitely is going to take time to develop.
Ambassador, one thing to mention, just because I saw this when I was there, there was one voting station that was kind of being promoted as an all-female voting station. Actually, the voting centers, polling stations are separated by gender. But this one had, in fact, all of the judges who oversee the election were also all women. And this is a new thing too. I mean, you can kind of see where these things are just working their way through in the Kuwaiti system. We're just getting to the point where there are women judges. The last I knew, there were only 8 women judges. I think that has been increased by now. They're kind of working their way through the system. But it shows kind of on a different level, on all of these different levels where women kind of need to be kind of led, brought through the process and sort of brought in more institutionally.
I want to bring another one of the questions from the audience into the discussion. We're talking about sort of differences between genders in Kuwaiti politics. This question basically asks the same thing for age differences, saying that many Kuwaitis are looking for a youthful leader, as has happened in Saudi Arabia, as has happened in Qatar. And would the appointment of a younger prime minister or younger ministers help drive that process of making the government younger and more responsive to the economic demands, at least of youth, be better? And is that something that is likely to happen? I mean, Yasmena, you are nodding, so I'll send this one to you first.
Yeah, I think this is something we've definitely seen or been hearing more of in the last few years. Many people have been wondering, you know, compared to MBS in Saudi and Al-Thani in Qatar, as to why in Kuwait we don't have younger leadership. And I think a lot of times when there is an appointment of a new prime minister, or there's talks happening to appoint a new prime minister, many names get thrown around as to, you know, why not have a younger prime minister in power. So as we mentioned earlier, that today there was an Emiri decree appointing al-Ahmed as the new prime minister, who is 71. So, you know, we kind of aren't let's say when it comes to age, not much is changing, and kind of going in line with the old way of doing things. I think it's important to note when it comes to age, I don't know if it's an unwillingness from the candidates that they are approaching, or if they're not being approached at all. I understand, or from talks that I've heard regarding the new appointment of the new prime minister, the former prime minister, Dr. Mohammed Sabah Salim, was approached and he declined heading the office. And then also they went back to the former prime minister, Sabah al-Khalid, who also declined entering into taking the position on his parliament. So I'm not sure if it is the unwillingness of the younger generation to participate in the government, or if they are not being given a chance.
Sean, I want to go to you because you brushed on this point in your article. One of our questions say, shouldn't Kuwait actually do things that promote younger folks in government, more economic development? It strikes me that, and we haven't really addressed the impending appointment of the Crown Prince, which needs to be accomplished by the end of November of this year. This is an opportunity to put in place a much younger person for the future leadership of the country. It's what happened in fits and starts in Saudi Arabia, same thing in Qatar. Do you see this as something that is likely to happen in Kuwait, given the very gradual changes in age that we've seen in the Kuwaiti leadership, and frankly, for all of the sons of Sheikh Ahmed as prime minister, just going from one brother to the next in birth order?
Yeah, I mean, we have to see generational succession within the royal family because, as you put it, I mean, all the sons of Sheikh Ahmed, who was ruler until 1950, they're too old. 4 of the 5 last emirs were sons of Sheikh Ahmed. And if you want to look at the political process cynically, where does Sheikh Ahmed Abdullah al-Ahmed come from, the new prime minister? He's a grandson of Sheikh Ahmed, albeit obviously through a different son than the current emir. So if nothing else, that this is a signal that he may be slowly being ready to ascend the ladders of the state. They are keeping it inside the family. So there are just two quick things I want to point out. Number one is that, yes, there has to be generational succession because they are like other like other Gulf families in the Emirates and in Saudi Arabia and so forth. They are just running out of half brothers of long deceased rulers to pass the torch between. But number two, it's not necessarily, I don't think it's not obvious to me that picking someone younger will automatically resonate with Kuwaiti citizens insofar that youth alone is a necessary but insufficient condition for a more effective, legitimate government. I think that the things that Kuwaiti citizens treasure, which are the electoral process, political participation, having the freest media sector in the Gulf, and perhaps all of the Arab world, these are all very important. But what they see other younger Gulf rulers doing in places like Saudi Arabia, for instance, under MBS, it's not clear to me as a political scientist that that model, the so-called Saudi or Gulf model, is actually going to be sustainable over the next 20 or 30 years. I mean, the Saudi government is making an enormous gamble that in 20 or 30 years, the current middle-class young Saudi median voter or the median citizen now is going to accept a lifestyle whereby they're taking out loans to buy a car. They can barely afford skyrocketing rents in Jeddah or Riyadh. There's no hope for loan forgiveness. And there's fiscal austerity in the state because much of the state has become privatized or is engaged in far more globalized engagements and it's turned its back on the old rentier model of state-led economics. That's an enormous gamble to take with millions of Saudi middle-class households. And that is the pathway that the Saudi government and some other Gulf governments are blazing. If that's the pathway that's become, I think, synonymized with having a young ruler, it's not clear to me that that's the appropriate pathway to Kuwait. That whatever pathway that that a younger generation of leaders in Kuwait picks has to be one that fits the mold of Kuwait. It has to be unique to Kuwait, conducive to political participation, and one that I think expresses the distinctiveness of the Kuwaiti model, which is not at all, I think, identical to the Emirati or the Saudi model of politics.
And Kristin, I know you've done a lot of work on generational change in the Gulf and in Kuwait, so I have to let you have a shot at this question as well, because I know you're very interested in it.
Yeah, I am very interested in it. And I think to some degree in Kuwait, I think they voiced if you want to call it that in Kuwait, it's always hard to do these things, sort of the middle class view or the median kind of view of youth. It's always kind of dangerous to simplify things that way, though, because of course there are these really important differences and contrasts within the Kuwaiti public. So of course you can speak to some more, let's say, elite Kuwaitis or something that would have a very different view on politics. You could talk to Kuwaitis that come from more the outer districts, what they usually call tribal, which is a difficult term I think we need to wrestle with, but we don't have time right now. Would have very different viewpoints about Kuwait's future. So as much as I love to look at Kuwaiti youth and the direction in which they're pointing in, sometimes it's a little bit dangerous to try to say there's one viewpoint on all of these things. I will say, I think the most important thing, though, is going to be the leadership at the highest point. And I really think this is the key issue for Kuwait right now, is going to be the naming of a crown prince. As you mentioned, Doug, that's going to happen this year. That's going to tell us a lot about the future direction of Kuwait, potentially, I guess I should say, because that's just really important. As much as it's a shared system, the leadership has so much to say in this. And I think there's been a real sort of evolution and what that's looking like. As Sean said, there is some push or some idea of moving to the next generation. As in Saudi Arabia, that's going to be a really big and potentially contentious step within the ruling family, because anytime you do that, you're potentially really coloring the lines of kind of future leadership and concentrating more within one family line. So if Sheikh Meshal were able to appoint one of his sons, for instance, that would be quite a statement. And we see a lot of the other kind of ruling lines, the family of al-Ahmed, Ahmed Nawaf kind of leading that one. I guess you can say Mohammed Sabah Salam, the kind of truncated Salam line. You still have the former Prime Minister Nasser Mohammed. who's a controversial older candidate, but he's still in the conversation, I think, and his son as well, who was once foreign minister. So you have these different lines within the family that are differently kind of lining up, hoping that they would be the next young appointment. And I think that's going to be very hard for the ruling family to wrestle with. So it's going to be a difficult year. I think I agree with Sean and the politics of Kuwait as that issue is decided.
Kristin, thank you. I'm afraid we are a little bit over time. I wanted to let our audience, who's been very interested and patient and stayed with us for the whole discussion. AGSIW does a lot on Kuwait, and in the past couple of weeks, we've done a couple of things that are much more focused on a younger generation and social changes in the country. Just today, we have an article that's come out on our website about a sort of cutting-edge new photography exhibit. And 2 weeks ago, we did a piece on Kuwait's hottest rap duo, KR and Chunky Monkey, and how Kuwait has taken sort of some American traditions of rap and hip hop and turned it into a Kuwaiti art form. Those of you who want to delve deeper into Kuwait should come to agsiw.org because there's a lot more for you to look at in addition to that. As I promised our panelists, I want to do a lightning round and ask each of you to give us just a few seconds on if you wanted one thing from the new combination of parliament and government to accomplish, what would it be? And Yasmena, I will start with you.
Yeah, so I think stability and cooperation between the two branches is the first thing that comes to mind. This is something that's been voiced across the board in Kuwait, as I've spoken to multiple people that, want to see, actual change that yields true cooperation in order to enact legislation and to further in order to move forward with several pending projects that have been paused over the last few years. I think another major few things is as we always discuss, the change of electoral law, which is something that many have been calling on, and I think another thing is, tackling the several economic issues, most importantly, economic reform. And finally, always a hot topic, but continuing the fight against corruption.
Yasmena, thank you very much. Sean, what would you like them to do?
Not to lose faith in democracy. Gridlock is a problem, but gridlock is a reflection of the democratic process working. Because do you know what countries in the region don't have gridlock? Egypt under Sisi, Syria under Assad. I mean, there are plenty of countries in the Arab world that don't have gridlock, but that's because they don't have institutional rules. The democratic practice is set up to allow properly elected institutions to actually block whatever the executive government and institutions want to do. So gridlock is certainly problematic. It has to be overcome through cooperation and more cordial trust mutually between the executive and the legislature. But just because gridlock exists doesn't mean the system itself is bad. I mean, we have plenty of gridlock here in America and Washington, D.C., but we're stuck with it and hoping that a new set of political actors will move us forward in the upcoming in the upcoming years. And I would just want Kuwaitis and Kuwaiti observers to think the same thing, that the Kuwaiti politics can dig itself out of its current hole, that the current deadlock or kind of stalemate that we see in parliament paralyzing politics, it's certainly not productive, but it doesn't mean the system is flawed. And it doesn't mean that Kuwait has to be more like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. Kuwait is a distinctive hybrid state, and it should not seek to emulate other Gulf practices which fit their context, but they don't fit Kuwait's context.
Sean, thank you. Before I go to Kristin for the last word, I'll note that Bushra Lawrence on our staff has dropped a couple of articles on Kuwait into the chat, so you can look at those right now and copy the links. I also want to apologize for the several people whose questions we are not going to get to this morning. But we will be doing more in Kuwait in the future. Don't worry. So we'll come back to you at some point. Kristin, I'll come back to you for the last word for today's discussion.
Sure. I'll do like I do in class, which is to open new questions instead of wrapping everything up. which is not always appreciated. But I would agree with Yasmena and Sean. I think for me, the most important thing is to get a government that can work and a government program. I think there are a lot of issues that they can make progress on. So if they get in place a government, the most important point for that will be, well, obviously the Emir and the government we know now who his prime minister is. The second issue, of course, is who the new speaker will be. That still has to be elected, and that's going to be a very important thing to watch. We didn't actually talk too much about the results of the elections, but while a lot of the same members were returned, what we did see was some relative shifts within that of people where their placement was in votes that may speak to a competitive race for speaker that can have a real impact between the former speaker Ahmed Sadoun and a previous speaker Marzouk Al-Ghanem. And it should be mentioned another speaker candidate who's thrown his hat in the ring, who I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Yasmena, would be the first, what I call it, tribal, an actual prince of the Awazim tribe that has put in his hat in the ring, Fahad bin Jama. So it'll be an interesting speaker race and an important one. I will just underline one other thing to watch for. We've talked about this issue of citizenship. I think that's going to be a really big issue under Sheikh Meshal on a number of different levels, both retracting citizenship, but there were also rumors about potentially playing with political rights due to levels of citizenship within Kuwait. This is something that we've seen in Qatar, has happened in the way that they have set up their Shura Council. So in Kuwait, that's another potential path that could be taken by the leadership that would mean a concentration or a narrowing of the Kuwaiti electorate even further. That would be a difference from just like doing away with the parliament altogether. That's just something that's kind of thrown out there as a rumor that may have just been brought on because of this fixation on citizenship issues. But I do think that general issue of citizenship and who's a Kuwaiti and who has a say in the Kuwaiti electorate is going to be an important thing to watch. Yeah.
Kristin, thank you. Again, thank you to all of our guests. We have a lot more on Kuwait, on the Gulf, and the Gulf's relationship with the world at agsiw.org, but also on Instagram, on Twitter, X, on LinkedIn, and on Facebook. So I want to thank Yasmena Al-Mulla, Sean Yum, and Kristin Smith Diwan for a fascinating conversation today. For all of you who joined us, thank you very much. We hope to see you again in the future, and have a good rest of your day wherever you are. Bye-bye.